Have you ever looked at a simple piece of fabric and imagined it becoming your new favorite piece of clothing? Join me as we bring that vision to life. Together, we'll sew this beautiful Betty blouse, transforming it from an idea into a wardrobe staple you'll love to wear again and again. In this video, I wanted to take you through the entire process of sewing this blouse step by step, which is perfect if you've always wondered what goes into sewing. If you've never sewn anything before, don't worry. Seeing the whole process come together will inspire you to realize that with a clear vision, the right pattern, and a little persistence, you can create something truly beautiful that you will be so proud of. When I start any sewing project, I always begin by putting pen to paper. It's such a great way to bring ideas to life. I like to gather inspiration from photos or designs I've come across online and then sketch them out, adding about the details I want to include. For this project, I've been dreaming of adding a collar to the Betty dress. So I spent some time exploring collar styles and sketching out a few ideas to find the perfect fit. The fabric for this blouse was a lucky find from Hobby Lobby last fall. It's a little different from what I typically gravitate towards, but sometimes stepping out of your comfort zone pays off. After washing it, I was thrilled with how beautifully it held up. It feels like it was meant for this project. Before diving into any project, I always recommend starting with a fabric wash and air dry. This helps prevent any unexpected shrinkage and keeps your handmade pieces looking their best. I prefer air drying all my fabrics to take extra care of them and ensure they last. For this project, I already had my Betty pattern cut and ready to go, stored in these clear envelopes tucked away in my pattern basket. It's such a helpful system for staying organized. Since I sketched out a collar design, I'll also be drafting a custom pattern piece for that later. I made one notable adjustment to the original Betty dress pattern. I turned it into a blouse. To do this, I added a few inches to the front and back bodice pieces, making it long enough to pair perfectly with pants. Whenever I make a pattern modifications, I trace the altered pieces onto new paper and label them clearly. This way, cutting is simple and I can easily reuse the pieces in the future. Here is a tip. If you are tracing patterns, don't forget to transfer all the notches and notes, and they will save you time and effort later. Now it's time to prepare the fabric. Lay it out with the right side facing down on your cutting mat. And can we talk about how amazing this large cutting mat is? It makes aligning and cutting patterns an absolute breeze, and it is a must-have if you are using a rotary cutter. For this project, I took extra care to line up the gingham squares so the pattern would stay parallel and look polished in the final piece. To maximize the fabric, I cut one pattern piece at a time and repositioning the fabric as needed for the next piece. Taking your time here pays off. You want to ensure everything aligns with the grain line, the fabric design is in the correct direction, and all the pattern pieces are properly placed. Cutting fabric can feel like a slow process, but I like to remind myself it's all part of the creative journey. As a mom of 2 little ones, I set small, achievable goals for each step. For example, one day might be dedicated to cutting the pattern pieces, while the next is for cutting the fabric itself. This way, I can enjoy the process without rushing, and trust me, the results are always worth it. When sewing anything that needs a bit of structure, interfacing is your best friend. For this project, I added interfacing to the collar, and I'll use it again later for the sleeve cuffs. It's amazing how much difference this little step can make in achieving a polished, professional look. To apply interfacing, place the bumpy, textured side against the wrong side of your fabric. Then, with a hot iron, press gently but firmly, letting the heat fuse with the interfacing to the fabric. For the collar, I only added interfacing to one side to keep it structured but not overly stiff. It is all about balance here. With the interfacing in place, I pinned the 2 collar pieces together, right sides facing. Starting at the back inside edge, I stitched around the perimeter of the collar, stopping at the opposite side and leaving a 3 to 4 inch opening to turn it right side out later. I sewed with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but this fabric added a unique challenge. It had a slight stretch to it. To handle this, I lengthened my stitch length, which worked wonderfully. If you need to practice with a scrap piece of fabric, I definitely recommend trying out different stitch lengths and tensions to find what works for you, your sewing machine, and your fabric. And when in doubt, change your sewing needle to a fresh one. That might be the thing tripping up your sewing process. Sewing curves takes a bit of finesse, and staying consistent with the seam allowance is key. I like to keep my eyes on the right edge of the presser foot, ensuring it aligns perfectly with the edge of the fabric. Little adjustments as you go will help maintain that smooth curve. Once the collar was stitched, I grabbed my pinking shears to trim away the excess fabric around the edges, except for the opening. Pinking shears are just a fancy word for zigzag scissors. This helps reduce bulk and makes for a cleaner finish. Then came the fun part, turning the collar right side out. This step can take a little patience, but taking the time to really shape those curves makes all the difference. Using my fingers and a point turner, which is basically a chopstick, I worked carefully to bring out the details, pressing everything flat with an iron as I went. For the finishing touch, I folded the edges of the opening inward and pressed them neatly into place. A good press is your other best friend when sewing. It's what transforms your work from good to great. Now that it is pressed and ready to go, I top stitch right along the edge at 1/8 of an inch to close this opening. Now I put my finished collar to the side for the next step. I grabbed my tie pattern pieces and headed to the ironing board. Preparing these smaller pieces might feel tedious at first, but trust me, once the ties are ready, the rest of the blouse will come together faster than you would expect. To prepare the ties, I started by folding one end towards the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch and giving it a good iron. Then I folded the long edges in towards the center, enclosing the seams with one more fold. Pressing as I went made all the difference in keeping everything crisp and clean. At the sewing machine, I stitched along the edge of the tie with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, repeating the process for the second tie. Taking the time to prep and finish these details really sets the foundation for that final piece you are going for. Now, with all the pattern pieces are prepped and ready, it's time to see the blouse come to life. There's nothing quite like watching your vision transform into something you were just sketching on paper, and now you're getting to see it come to life so you can wear it and enjoy it. To construct the Betty blouse, I followed the same steps as the original Betty dress, starting with the bodice. First, I laid the front bodice pieces right side up on my workspace. Then I placed the back bodice pieces on top, aligning the shoulders. Using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I stitched the shoulder seams together. Afterwards, I finished the raw edges to give it a neat, durable finish. I use a serger to finish all of my edges. It's efficient, it gives me a professional edge. It'll make sure that my garments last for years and years to come. With the bodice pieces laid right side up, it was time to add the collar and ties I had prepped earlier. The collar fit perfectly into the neckline of the blouse, and I used pins to carefully secure everything in place. The ties were positioned just beneath the collar, ensuring they would sit beautifully once finished. Next, I moved on to the facing pieces. I serged the raw edges to prevent fraying, then folded them towards the wrong side and top stitched to create a clean, polished edge. Once the facings were prepared, I placed them on top of the blouse, right sides together, carefully aligning the shoulder seams, V-neck, and neckline curves. After pinning everything securely, I stitched it all together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, taking my time to pivot at the corners and keep the collar and ties perfectly in place. Turning the facing towards the inside of the blouse was a magical moment. It was the first time I could really see my original vision coming to life. To ensure a clean, nice finish, I clipped the fabric near the ties and used my shears to snip carefully at the V-neck point. You want to make sure you don't go over the stitching. This little step made it so much easier for the facing to lie flat and smooth. To keep the facing secure and prevent it from shifting, I added a top stitch along the edge of the facing, sewing right at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. For beginners, stitching from the wrong side of the garment is a great tip. It ensures to catch all the fabric and creates a neat, even finish. As I sew, to keep my piece that I'm sewing tidy by carefully snipping off any extra threads along the way. It may seem like a small detail, but it really helps the end product come together and you won't miss all of those tiny little threads at the end. And of course, I always make sure to give the blouse a good press after each step. I absolutely love my cordless iron. It's become one of my must-have sewing tools since I picked it up last year. Next up, attaching the sleeves. Sleeves can be tricky, especially when you want them to fit perfectly into the armhole. One tip to make this easier is to double check that all the notches on your pattern pieces are marked clearly and that you are pinning the right side of the sleeve to the right side of the bodice pieces. I start by lining up the middle notch of the sleeve with the shoulder seam of the blouse. Once that is in place, I move onto the other notches, pinning them in place. After that, I add extra pins around the entire sleeve to ensure there is no extra fabric. The more pins, the better. At the sewing machine, I sew the sleeve at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, carefully maneuvering around the corners, and I take my time making sure the fabric is feeding smoothly through the machine. And I always backstitch at the beginning and end to secure the seam. Once the sleeve is sewn, I finish off the raw edges by serging them. Like I said earlier, I love using a serger. It's one of my favorite tools. Now I take my blouse to the work table, laying it out neatly with the right sides facing each other. I match up the sleeves, armpits, and side seams, pinning them in place. Then I sew along the side seams at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finishing with a serged edge. I repeat this process on the other side, and just like that, my blouse is almost finished. One important sewing tip is to always sew in the same direction on both sides of the garment. For example, I always start at the opening of the sleeve, sew along the sleeve, pivot at the armpit, and sew down to the bottom of the bodice. This helps keep the fabric aligned and prevents any discrepancies in the direction of the garment. Now for the cuffs. I cut out 2 cuffs that I had forgotten to cut earlier and decided to add some interfacing, just like I did with the collar. Before sewing the cuff, I press it to create a crease where I will fold it later. This step makes folding so much easier. Then I turn up the tension and stitch length of my sewing machine to create gather stitches. I sew around the sleeve opening, making sure to stop just before the seam. This method naturally gathers the fabric, making it easy to match the gathered edges to the cuff. I pin the gathered sleeve to the cuff, ensuring everything matches, and then sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Afterwards, I fold the cuff right side out, making sure one edge covers the raw edge in the gathers. I stitch around the cuff's edges to hide the seams and secure everything in place. The final step is hemming. At this point, I try on the blouse to see how the fit is. Actually, I do this all along the sewing process just to make sure that it is going in the direction that I want and I don't have to back up a few steps if I mess up. Depending on how much extra fabric I added to the bodice, I decide how much I want to hem. I opted for a generous 2-inch hem, which is not usually how you would hem, but that is what worked for me this time. I fold the bottom edge of the bodice 1 inch, press it, and then fold it another inch before pressing again. I start at the side seam, backstitch, and sew all the way around the hem, finishing where I started. And of course, I finish it off with a good press to give the blouse that crisp, polished look. I think this is important even when you're making something that is flowy and airy and light. Ironing every step of the way is going to really elevate your garment. I feel like I've said that 10 times in this one video. My Betty blouse with a collar is finally complete, and it's been a staple in my wardrobe since I made it last fall. What a joy it is to create something with my hands and wear it over and over. To see a couple yards of fabric turn into something I can wear and grab and feel represents my style and what I like to wear. I can't wait to see what you create as you continue your own sewing journey. You can find the Betty pattern below, and I can't wait to see what you create.